When Speed Racer burst onto the scene in beautiful kinetic Technicolor, it was something that audiences hadn't seen before. The Wachowskis were finally back into the director's chair after making the Matrix trilogy, and this is the big statement they chose to make. To take on one of their favorite cartoons growing up and transform it and fully adapt it onto the big screen. Most live-action adaptations of animation tried to make it more realistic. What would it be like if it was live action? But the 2008 Speed Racer wasn't really interested in that. They wanted to try to replicate an animated film onto the big screen, and in some cases made it actually more animated than the actual property that they were adapting. It was freewheeling, it was out there, it was something completely different, and it couldn't be contained. So of course, it totally bombed. This is How Did Speed Racer Bomb at the Box Office? To understand why someone would want to make a live-action adaptation of Speed Racer, you have to understand how popular Speed Racer was in the early 90s. It felt like pop culture in the early 90s couldn't stop making references to it. Nirvana especially, who used Chim Chim in an early logo of theirs and would talk about it publicly, as well as MTV literally playing Speed Racer cartoons at about 7 o'clock or so. That's actually how I saw it. I remember so much Speed Racer merchandise, I was confused as I watched all the current cartoons at the time, and suddenly this thing's merchandise was everywhere, and then it was on MTV. Like, I didn't see reruns before, and suddenly you couldn't get enough of it. It was just hugely popular because these bands reminded everyone of their nostalgia. Even Sponge covered it on the Saturday Morning Cartoons compilation. So obviously they were going to make a live action adaptation. In 1992, it was announced through the Chicago Tribune when they were making kind of a Speed Racer movie that was going to kind of compile various episodes and releasing that. They announced for some reason, the director of Space Jam, I'm still confused how he's involved in this, announced that it was happening at Warner Brothers under the development of Silver Pictures and Joel Silver. Then after that, in 1994, we found out Henry Rollins was cast as Racer X. And seemed like it was moving along. Then in 1995, in June, Johnny Depp was cast as Speed, with production starting in October in Arizona and California. And I keep seeing that Nick Cage was also cast as Racer X at one point. Not exactly sure what happened with that and if Henry Rollins was still around or what was going on there. Apparently they did do location scouting, and they were pretty well along to actually making this film. Julian Temple was actually brought on to direct the film, directed the Sex Pistols movie, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, and directed a ton of music videos that you've definitely seen before, as well as directing a bomb that was so big it literally almost crushed the British film industry, Absolute Beginners. So it sounds like you totally want him doing a big budget movie. Apparently they got so far along in this version, Joel Silver later said in an interview that they were designing cars so they could do things that no one had ever seen before. It was going to be, I'm assuming, a lot more practical, and they had made $1 million car entirely made out of chrome, but because it was entirely made out of chrome, you actually couldn't film it from any angle because it was too shiny. True story, or according to Joel Silver. This version sort of kind of crashed and burned. In August, Johnny Depp requested time off for personal reasons, delaying production, and then because of an overly high budget, Julian Temple left the movie because he didn't want to crash another film industry. And without a director, Depp also left, and then the studio considered actually Gus Van Sant for this, but wouldn't give him writing privileges, so that didn't work out. Then after that, they briefly, in 1997, considered Alfonso Cuarón, but that didn't work either. And then various different versions were under development with Mark Levin, Jennifer Flankett, J.J. Abrams, and Patrick Reed Johnson, and none of those happened. I'm assuming that was more of a writing thing, but who knows, since it seems like everyone had a lunch and talked about Speed Racer in Hollywood at some point. That's how you actually got the VW Speed Racer ads in the mid-90s, because the license Warner Brothers was doing nothing with, and they allowed those commercials to happen just to kind of keep it more still culturally relevant. And then, I'm still not done. And then in 2000, Warner Brothers and Lauren Schuler Donner hired Hype Williams, another music video director. They also hired two screenwriters, Christian Gudegast and Paul Shearing, to write the screenplay. But eventually, without production getting underway in 2001, Hype Williams and the screenwriters left the project to, actually make things. And then in 2004, still going, this is like like, I don't know how many versions of this movie we're at this point. Vince Vaughn spearheaded a revival of the project that would develop the characters more and presented his take to the studio. Vince Vaughn was cast as Racer X and would be an executive producer. I don't know of any directors or anyone else involved, but again, since production was taking forever, he soon left the project as well. But then in 2006, the Wachowskis were brought in by the studio to write and direct the film, making this their first post-Matrix movie as directors. This also made sense as Joel Silver had produced The Matrix and had worked with the Wachowskis before. Apparently they presented an amazing kind of previs sequence to show Warner Brothers what they could do, and they were absolutely sold on it, which I assume was totally almost as awesome as what we got into the movie. They even offered Racer X to Keanu Reeves, which he turned down, and apparently Henry Rollins was still around asking if he could do Racer X, which is totally sort of sad if that's true. But then they finally made Speed Racer in 2008. After all that, this is a high priority for the studio. They still felt there was a lot of love for this property and totally wanted to make it. And since they had someone as big as the Wachowskis were in the 2000s, they thought this would be an awesome movie. I have to say, I think it is an awesome movie. It's amazing because when we look at live action adaptations of animation, none of them really want to try anything new. They want to try to replicate sort of what the animated property is, but also do it in live action. They never have a clear distinction and theory about what they're doing. But Speed Racer isn't that. Speed Racer knows it's doing the Racer X storyline. It gets that it's episodic. It understands the kind of story it is, but it wants to try to replicate kind of this crazy animation world, the world where anything can happen, the world where nothing can be contained, this beautiful colored animated world, you know. And they get that, like, look, this guy's name is literally Speed Racer. He's the titular character, and his titular name is stupid, and his family is literally called Racer. Like, it's kind of like when you watch this movie, it's got its heart on its sleeve, but it's not like doing it like most movies who are like, I have my heart on my sleeve, because that means something. It has its heart on its sleeve because it's painfully literal in terms of what it's saying. It's not trying to like have all these meanings behind it in certain regards. It's trying to be Speed Racer. And maybe people weren't ready for that. If you look at most kids' films, they don't try to do the big auteur statement. They don't try to do things that are different. They try to be painfully safe. And I understand it's a kids' film, so nobody wants to test the waters or be smart or something. But honestly, I think the Wachowskis wanted something more from that. This has a lot more in common, and I've said this before, with Robert Altman's Popeye, which really wanted to be an adaptation of the comic strip that Popeye came from. Whereas this version of Speed Racer very much wants to be a very faithful adaptation of Speed Racer, while also showing what you could do and how you would present Speed Racer in a modern context while not holding back. Most of these adaptations are done to have a sense of realism. Speed Racer and the Wachowskis never cared about realism. I mean, think of all their movies. They don't really like that at all. They're not interested in that. And I don't want to see a realistic Speed Racer. I'm glad the Johnny Depp one didn't work out. That would have totally sucked. I mean, there's no way that would be good. But then when you look at this film, it's exciting. It's beautiful. I remember seeing this on an IMAX screen and it blew my fucking mind. I was like, how can this even be real? Before we got all the Disney stuff with the live action adaptations that were like photorealistic and boring, you got things like the Flintstones and George of the Jungle, which never really sold it as well. You know, I never believed it. I never wanted to rewatch those as much. But Speed Racer came along and I was like, this is everything I wanted. This is the intense pre-production that animation has always had. This is the intense story building. This is using those techniques to tell amazing stories. Look at that opening sequence where you literally understand the entire thesis of the movie, what's important to those characters and that family, while also having an awesome racing sequence. It does so much, it's almost chaotic to think about. So yeah, I get why it bombed. It was $120 million. It was an over 2-hour kids movie. Sure, I understand that. But in some ways, Speed Racer didn't care about that. Its intentions as a movie had as much of its heart on its sleeve as the thesis of the entire movie, and maybe people weren't ready to accept that. Now, 2008, when it came out, might not have been the best time. This was the same summer of Dark Knight, which everyone points out is why this movie bombed, but this movie came out in May. This movie came out in May 9th, 2008. That was about 2 months before The Dark Knight, so there was not much of an overlap that was ever going to happen. But what it did come out against the week before was the first Iron Man. And certainly, I don't think anyone thought the first Iron Man was going to be the hit it was. No one really knew what was going to happen with that fully. It sort of showed where we were at cinematically at the time. We were much more of a realistic, darker kind of period, the time of Chris Nolan and Paul Greengrass, than we were anything else. Iron Man sure was kind of a different sort of a film, taking on more of a comic booky approach than even The Dark Knight would, but it wasn't pushing it as far as Speed Racer certainly was. And Speed Racer actually opened in third, below both Iron Man, which made $51 million, and What Happens in Vegas, the Ashton Kutcher Cameron Diaz comedy, which made $20 million, and then Speed Racer made $18 million, which was crushing, even though it was in way more theaters than What Happens in Vegas. And it stayed in the top 5 for a while. Worldwide, Speed Racer only made about $93 million. In America, $43 million. And believe it or not, the Ashton Kutcher Cameron Diaz comedy made $219 million worldwide, which is crazy because I hear no one ever talk about or reference even seeing that movie to this day, and yet it outgrew Speed Racer. Clearly, people weren't ready for this movie. I don't think it was a lack of competition. I don't think it was... A lot of people seem to, especially in this one, I've read a lot of articles that really go after like Harry Knowles and Comic-Con and stuff like that. I don't think it's that they like made people believe a cult movie could be a real big hit. I honestly don't think people were ready for it at that time. And I don't know if a mainstream audience was fully ready for this kind of a movie. It's insanely different. It's an insanely different kind of a film. And the fact that you have a crappy Ashton Kutcher comedy going against it and it outgrossed it kind of shows that. You have a film that unlocks imagination, and then you have a film literally called What Happens in Vegas, which isn't even like a really that original of a title, starring one star who we don't really think about having a film career anymore. I don't know. It is disappointing. It was disappointing at the time. I ran to see it in IMAX because I knew it was going to be taken out of theaters. And I don't think it's because the studio didn't believe in it. There's tons of merchandise. They're really selling it. They're really trying. They obviously wanted to have a relationship with the Wachowskis, but it didn't fully take. Speed Racer would go on to become a cult hit. People continue to love it, to talk about how different it is, talk about the visuals in it, how the profiles zoom through the screen and everything like that. I haven't seen it referenced in too many places except for that OKKO crossover, which makes sense because obviously I saw it with the creator of that show when I saw it in IMAX, and we had a really awesome time seeing it, so I totally understand why he would make that reference. It was an amazing movie, and right when I was tired of the Wachowskis, I liked The Matrix, I liked Bound, but after the 2 Matrix sequels, I kind of was a little tuned out from them, other than the Animatrix, which, they didn't really make. This showed me the real possibility of them as filmmakers, and after this, they kind of really went off into this, started a whole, we're fully in our weird auteur mode. From their next film would be Cloud Atlas, which they actually self-financed, but sort of broke even, didn't do amazing, and then after that, Jupiter Ascending, which Warner Brothers asked them to make, sort of a new franchise. It totally bombed, and then Warner Brothers ended their relationship with the Wachowskis. I know or at least one of them is back with a new Matrix movie, but it's sad at the possibilities of what the Wachowskis could really do. This is probably my favorite film from them that isn't The Matrix, because duh. But I still have such a fondness for this film. I actually had a bootleg of this movie that I really played to death that summer because I just couldn't keep my eyes off of this movie. It's a film you fall in love with because it's a film that shows you the possibility of how you bring animation to a live action world. And in some ways, it shows you what technology could do to really fully flesh that out. It shows you a possibility that The Lion King and Aladdin could never even dream of and probably wouldn't even try to do. I think there's a lot of reasons that Speed Racer bombed, but most of them is because this movie was almost too pure, too much of its own thing. And in a world where you had Dark Knight and Bourne Identity movies and, Iron Man taking all of the kind of cultural air out of the room, and some Ashton Kutcher movie that I'm just going to direct all my energy at because, who's going to defend that one? I fully think that Speed Racer was just too much for this world, and that's always a really sad thing. There's not 100% of a reason maybe it bombed other than it was 2 hours and 15 minutes, and that was probably too long. But I fully don't think there was too many reasons how it bombed. The studio believed in it. The directors believed in it. They had all the creative control they could have. They had all the hype behind them. But I think what really killed it was just the world wasn't ready at the time, and maybe the world never will be ready. But who cares? Because honestly, we got an awesome movie like Speed Racer. How did it bomb? It bombed because it was too awesome, and this world isn't ready for that amount of awesomeness.